Just 7 months after the final chapter of the original Yu-Gi-Oh manga, fans were introduced to an all-new animated sequel, Yu-Gi-Oh! Generation Next. While GX was met with mixed reviews at first, it's garnered somewhat of a cult following in recent years. The locus of this attention has been exclusively on the anime, but what many fail to realize is that GX actually has a manga adaptation. Debuting in the December 17th, 2005 edition of Shueisha's V-Jump magazine, almost 1 year after the launch of the anime, the GX manga would go on a 6-year run, totaling 64 chapters across 9 volumes. Supervised by the franchise's original creator, Kazuki Takahashi, the manga was written and illustrated entirely by his former assistant, Naoyuki Kageyama. Despite his assistance in the original Yu-Gi-Oh manga, Kageyama was not involved in the creation of or production of the GX anime. As such, he makes clear that the manga is wholly separate from the anime, explicitly stating that this version is very different from the anime and that it's better if readers look at it as something completely separate. He bores the basic premise of a dueling academy and uses many of the same characters, but how he interprets and develops these characters, as well as the direction in which he takes the story, is strikingly different than its anime counterpart. Accordingly, this manga is better thought of as an independent spin-off of the original Yu-Gi-Oh manga, rather than an adaptation of the GX anime. For that reason, I will avoid comparisons to the anime where possible. I will, however, make frequent reference to the original manga, highlighting how GX handles the duels, the themes present in the original, and how it stacks up overall. Yu-Gi-Oh! GX takes place on Duel Academy Island, an institute established by Seto Kaiba for prospective duelists to learn the ins and outs of both the card game and pro scene. Students are given a rank according to their performance on a series of theoretical and practical exams, and are expected to rank up over their tenure at the academy, before eventually graduating and, ideally, entering the pro scene. Although the idea of a dueling school has been subject to much ridicule, it helps better situate the role of duel monsters within the world of the series. A good way of understanding this is by means of a real-world parallel, namely esports. While there's no gamer school in the way that GX has a duel academy, they have both carved out their specific niches within their respective cultures. Both are generally well known by the masses, even if the majority do not compete in them, and there is a dedicated demographic of people whose lives are centered around them. The benefit of this setup is that it requires much less suspension of one's beliefs to understand why duel monsters is so important to the characters in the manga, despite being set in an otherwise ordinary-ish world. I would argue that GX surpasses the original manga in this respect, as the original manga asks a lot of the readers in terms of suspending their beliefs. After all, the fate of the world being determined by the outcome of 2 middle school students possessed by the spirits of ancient Egypt playing a children's card game can be a bit difficult to digest at first, but students enrolling in a school to professionally compete in a niche competition is not so much. While GX begins with a strong premise that helps ease readers into the world it's presenting, the execution of the first chapter is riddled with problems that will continue to plague the series as a whole. For one, GX has major pacing issues. In the opening pages of chapter 1 alone, the reader's presented with Jaden defeating a random opponent and being congratulated by Cyrus, a brief, unrelated exchange between Jaden and Alexis, Cyrus being defeated by a prospective instructor, Mr. Ryuga, and Jaden talking to Cyrus after the match. 4 interactions, 2 duels across 4 locations, all within the span of 5 pages. Because of how little screen time each interaction's given, they can come across as hollow, as if they're doing the bare minimum to establish certain plot points and move the plot along. This issue crops up regularly and makes a lot of the dialogue feel uninteresting. Related to this is a second major issue, that a significant amount of the dueling happens off-screen. Not only are the 2 opening duels given a page each, but the final duel of the opening chapter, the climax, starts in the middle of the 5th turn. What makes this issue particularly pressing is that GX is a manga that especially focuses on dueling, more so than even Yu-Gi-Oh! Duelist. Given that, one would expect the manga to slowly build up the duels, carefully creating the momentum necessary to engage readers and deliver a huge climax, but this is often not the case. To make matters worse, this problem isn't only limited to less important duels between one-off characters, but extends to major duels between main characters. In Chapter 8, for example, Jaden and Cyrus are forced into a high-stakes duel where, if Cyrus loses, he's expelled from the academy, and if Jaden loses, his deck is confiscated. Surely something of this magnitude would be treated with the utmost care, right? Wrong. Not only does the duel start halfway through, but the chapter begins with the 2 dueling before any context is given as to why. This in media res approach simply does not work for this style of manga, because a duel can only deliver on its excitement if the action is slowly built up step by step. So thrusting readers into the middle of the action is an inefficient way of creating intrigue. Further, the whole point of starting in media res is to promise the reader that there's plenty of excitement to come, often because because a slower start is necessary to set it up. But given GX's breakneck pacing, there's no reason Kageyama couldn't have simply built up the duel. There's no questioning the overall rockiness of GX's opening chapters, but there are certain aspects that are either improved upon or utilized to create more opportunities for genuinely enjoyable moments. The first aspect is that by the 4th volume, the manga switches from 21 pages to 31 pages. This may seem like a minor change, but by giving Kageyama more space, he no longer has to resort to starting duels halfway through, and can use the extra space to show the duel in its entirety. This suggests that the earlier issues were the result of limitations surrounding the manga's publication, something completely out of his hands. While there may have been alternative ways of dealing with the previous page limit, and so Kageyama doesn't totally escape the previous criticism, one can see that having more pages dissolves the issue entirely. The second aspect is that Kageyama's heavy focus on dueling translates into more dynamic and complex duels than anything in the original manga. Just like in Battle City, GX's duels are set within an established rule set, but with more improved rules to help bring the card game in line with the real-life TCG. For example, fusion and tribute monsters can now attack at the turn they were summoned, which was not previously the case. While this type of dueling is still subject to the same criticisms as Battle City, namely battles often feel determined by luck as opposed to the duelist's own merit, it at least offers higher quality and more exciting duels than ever before. The other aspect which works to GX's advantage is the nature of its protagonist, Jaden. In the original series, Yugi's presented as the good guy who will always triumph over evil. The consequence of this is that in most of his duels, the reader expected him to win. The problem then, especially in Battle City, was that some of these victories didn't feel justified. They were not a result of his own autonomy, but of luck, which can come across as cheap and undeserving. This, however, is not the case in GX. Although the manga actively chooses to begin with a scene of Jaden winning, invoking the image of the undefeatable Yugi, GX quickly subverts this expectation by having Jaden lose several important duels. Not only does this come as a shock to the reader, but it fundamentally changes how they perceive the duels. No longer will they expect Jaden to simply steamroll every opponent because he's the protagonist. Moreover, because of the large cast of exceptionally strong duelists, Jaden does not always play the role of the hero who saves the day. There are instances in which this role is delegated to another member of the cast, such as Chaz. These two features humble Jaden in a way that allows duels to be unpredictable, keeping the reader engaged. Among the original Yu-Gi-Oh! Trilogy, GX is best known for its characters, and more specifically, Jaden's development across the 4 seasons. Given that, the question naturally arises, how does the GX manga fare in light of this? Well, much like its anime counterpart, Jaden is given a fair amount of development. Early on, the manga establishes that Jaden's deck is valuable to him, and in Volume 2, readers find out why. It was a dying gift from a mentor-like figure from his past, Koyo Hibiki. This backstory was actually fairly moving and cast Jaden in a whole new light. Unlike his journey in the anime, manga Jaden is principally concerned with establishing his own identity. For the first half of the manga, he essentially wants to be Koyo, but by the second half, he comes into his own identity, which is beautifully represented by him putting aside the deck given to him by Koyo and using his own cards. This journey of self-discovery has an incredible conclusion, which perfectly wraps up the manga as a whole. Now, while I have nothing but praise for Jaden's character arc in the manga, my praise ends with him. The manga is unfortunately bloated with characters that are given little to no background and have zero personality. The most readers will remember about the majority of the cast is the type of deck they play, as it's only when dueling that any of these characters distinguish themselves from one another in any meaningful way. Perhaps the worst example of this is with the 5 American duelists introduced in the second half. They exist solely to provide the main cast with the opportunity to face strong duelists in a tournament setting and lack any individuality whatsoever. At the very least, the duels are generally well done, with a lot of dynamic action, complex back and forths, and unique new monsters, but one can't help but to feel that, with a slightly smaller cast, some of these side characters could have been given screen time to help individuate them in meaningful ways. The final aspect I want to discuss is the antagonist. Recall that one of GX's greatest virtues is how it situates duel monsters within the world of the series. While I maintain that this is still generally positive, it does work against itself in the latter half, and this has to do with Kageyama's attempt at introducing a supernatural element into the manga. It's important to note that the events of the manga are entirely motivated by the antagonist, a spirit from ancient Egypt trying to resurrect itself, who's drawn to Duel Academy out of a necessity to complete the resurrection. While the Yu-Gi-Oh! Franchise is no stranger to ancient Egyptian antagonists, the problem in GX is that it is set in an otherwise ordinary world, so the first few mentions of shadow games can break the reader's immersion and come off as jarring. This could be forgiven if the antagonist was executed well enough to justify this shift in tone, but unfortunately, that's not the case. Readers are given a couple pages worth of backstory in the first half, but otherwise, the antagonist does not make any significant appearances until the last 2 volumes. He was the evil spirit of a criminal in ancient Egypt who was sealed into a stone tablet, which was then destroyed. Some 3,000 years later, said spirit somehow, unbeknownst to the reader, gains control of the American Duel Academy and uses its students in an attempt to resurrect itself. Not a particularly unique backstory as far as Yu-Gi-Oh is concerned, but what absolutely ruins any semblance of intrigue around this character is shattered in the final volume. In order to demonstrate why, I must go into spoilers, so feel free to skip the following section if you wish to remain unspoiled. Straight up, the final antagonist, Tragodia, explicitly states that his motivation for coming back and killing humans is because, and I quote, he was bored and nothing more. I can't begin to describe how disappointing of an ending this was to read. Not only are we, as readers, deprived of any real background and motivations for the main antagonist's actions, but it just makes the inclusion of this supernatural element feel like Kageyama's half-hearted attempt at connecting GX with the original series. I genuinely believe that GX could have been a better written manga without the supernatural elements. There was so much more Kageyama could have worked with, such as Jaden and Chaz's shared past and present rivalry, or the dynamic between the American and Japanese academies. Literally anything else would have been better. So in short, Yu-Gi-Oh! GX is, at best, a series of semi-interesting duels with a well-written protagonist strung together by a horrible ancient Egyptian subplot, and at worst, a shallow attempt at continuing the Duel Monsters legacy that we could otherwise do without. As a Yu-Gi-Oh! Fan, I'm willing to extend the series some charity and focus on the good more than the bad, but giving this series anything higher than a 7 out of 10 would be unreasonably generous. My name is Doofy, and thanks for watching.